This is a WECT News special report.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Murray. Thank you very much for joining us for this special broadcast of the City of Wilmington and New Hanover County's funeral procession and the graveside ceremony for one of the victims of the 1898 massacre. That's a long time ago. Again, to understand why we're here today, we've got to look back to what led up to the tragic events way back in 1898. It was back in November of that year, on the heels of the state Democratic Party's white supremacy campaign, that violence broke out in Wilmington. And that's what today's remembrance is all about. And the history lesson that leaders hope that we all learn from all month long now this November. A white mob burned the offices of a black newspaper, killed at least 25 African Americans, and then threw the elected Republican government of the city out of town and installed a white Democratic mayor and council in its place. Again, historically significant. This is the only successful coup in the history of this country, happening in our own backyard all those years ago. Linda Thompson, who is New Hanover County's Chief Diversity Equity Officer, explaining why today's ceremony really is just all about healing Wilmington's open wounds.
While it was tragic, it was horrific, I want people to understand we can move forward. After we look back at what happened, we are so resilient. So many brilliant people lived in this community in the 1800s. African Americans who were productive, vibrant at their time. And so my hope is that as we study it, as we look at it, we'll become better because of it and realize that we certainly can heal forward.
We're live at this ceremony here today, the family members of Joshua Halsey, all these years and all these generations later, coming to have really a sense of peace, a sense of understanding, and a lot of questions as well. You know, it's a long time ago, and we talk about this being really a month of remembering and trying to have reconciliation. We've heard over the past several years the frame Black Lives Matter, and it goes back to all these years ago as well. Who would have thought then what happened in other parts of this country would again magnify the healing that needs to happen in this very city. And people are hoping that this is part of that healing process. If you're new to town, maybe you've never heard of this. This is part of our history here in southeastern North Carolina, a dark side of that history, but again, it's history all the same. And we do not want history repeating itself. And that's why watching YouTube videos, going on our website, going on the city's website, learning more about this can really put what's happening sometimes, making headlines today, in perspective. This is a marker, a brand new marker for someone who was born all those years ago. Joshua Halsey, born, as you see right there, back in 1852, and he died back in 1898, the first person identified now, significantly, in that massacre of 1898. And again, as we see, family members, dignitaries, all here to honor that gentleman and to pay attention to what's happening here historically on this day, this cold and dreary day in the city of Wilmington. Wilmington was home to a very large, middle-class African American community. Men and women who held power in this town. This month, there are several events taking place commemorating the anniversary of 1898. Again, Linda Thompson says it's very important to remember that painful time in our history in order for us to heal and to move forward.
Not a lot of people in our area knew anything about it. And so for the last possibly 20, 25 years, we actually discovered it. We've built a park to commemorate that. And so as we talk about it and face it, we're able to heal.
We go back to the cemetery now.
We've come to commemorate such a horrible event. Just take a moment and look around. This is the very cemetery that many ran to hide in the swamps, listening to the shots, listening to the screams, calling on the Lord. We've come also to memorialize John Halsey. He's a representative of so many that died. Let's give the Halsey family a round of applause.
Well, good afternoon. truly honored to be here to be a part of this ceremony. Oftentimes when we come to a funeral, we're here to celebrate the life of someone lived. We're here to tell great stories about the great things that they've done in our lives. But today we're here to acknowledge a terrible tragedy that happened in our community many years ago, that happened to Joshua Halsey and many others. We're here to acknowledge that although terrible things happened then, we have the ability to heal today. As I look across the field here, I see a true reflection of our community today. As I see black people and white people, Hispanic, men, women, and children, all coming together to reconcile and to heal. I'm honored to be one of your county commissioners, along with Commissioner Rob Zapple and our chair, Judy Olson-Bozeman, that will speak shortly, to help our community heal, to help our community come together, to help our community find ways to forge together. To the Halsey family, we acknowledge your pain. We share in your hurt, but we also rejoice in your future. You see, when a funeral happens, you have family and friends come together. And today we have family and friends that are here today to celebrate again the life of Mr. Halsey and to celebrate the new life of New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington as we work together. May God bless us all.
Good afternoon. I would also like to recognize Councilman Clifford Barnett that is with us here today. Thank you. Today we gather united in our resolve to move Wilmington forward and continue healing a wound inflicted more than 120 years ago. We gather to mourn the lives that were lost and reflect on the worst moment in Wilmington's history. But let's not overlook the significance of this moment. Here we stand in solidarity with our neighbors who look differently than us, who worship differently than us, who think, speak, and experience life differently than us. And we do so where a century ago people were killed for their differences. 1898 left our community broken. But today, 123 years later, we continue to work of healing and reconciliation. November 10th was a dark day for Wilmington, but I today look before me and see light and hope. Wilmington endured devastating loss in 1898. Once a thriving and diverse community for all, we had an integrated and pioneering government, but we were robbed of those advances. Believe me when I say we are working hard so that one day, despite what we have been through, we will be known as a bastion of equity, hope, and light for all people. God bless you and thank you.
My name is John Jeremiah Sullivan. I'm a writer and reporter for the New York Times Magazine. Thousands of people fled the racist militia and sought refuge in this place, in this cemetery, mainly in the swamps right over there behind it. When the killing started, it was an unusually mild November day, so the people fleeing up the streets from downtown wore summer clothes. But when evening came, the temperature dropped 40 degrees, a lot like what happened today. Old people and infants died of exposure back in the swamps. A journalist remembered that you could hear them singing hymns back there to ward off the fear. The violence was not random or impulsive. It was meticulously planned or permitted at every level of government, from the White House to the courthouse. And the violence had a very specific purpose. It was intended to break apart an interracial coalition called the Fusion, which had formed several years earlier and which in 1898 was poised to transform the state. And the violence worked, at least until now. The strange question I mentioned was this: why, despite the fact that so many people were murdered in the city that day, were there no graves? Zero. There was no place in town where a person or a family or a descendant could go and stand and say, here lies a victim of the massacre of 1898. No place where the community could engage in the deepest and most traditional form of mourning at the graveside. There are reasons for this. Many of the bodies we know were pushed into the river. Others were buried privately in backyards. There may be a mass grave somewhere. This research has only begun. But for now, we hope to find one. Maybe if there were a grave, some kind of healing would be possible that hadn't been so before, in a city that has never recovered from the events of that day.
Joshua was murdered by a system, and others like him were murdered by a system. It was not just a group of white supremacists acting on their own. To remember this history like that is to remember it wrong. It was not some insane folk. It was very sane people who plotted and planned. And we cannot have a normal funeral as though he and others died a normal death ordained by God. Who killed Joshua Haley? Some say, as I said, it was just a group of white supremacists. No. The truth is, more people were killed on November 10th, 1898, Mr. Mayor, than were killed per capita on 9/11. It was government officials, politicians, the newspaper, and red shirts who had been trained in the military, went in the military to learn how to be trained so they could come back and use military tactics, not to undermine Wilmington, but to undermine the entire United States of America and the South and the forward progress of this nation. Who killed Joshua Haley? Halsey. The church killed him. Because some of the meetings were held in the church. Churches preached sermons on that Sunday right here before November the 10th. Who killed him? He was killed by a charismatic, racist orator who went all around the state and country warning people against so-called Negro domination and the dangers of white and black people working together. In other words, he was killed by a man that had rallies and would rev people up at their rallies with his lies. Sound familiar? Yeah, if you didn't want me to come, I'm all right, I can go home. Huh? He was killed by a political party. Now, some will tell you it was the Democratic Party. No, it was the Jefferson Davis Democratic Party that was left over after the Civil War. And he was killed by the racist lines being taught at that time by well, it wasn't Fox News, the News and Observer. Who killed, say his name. Say his name. Say his name.
Joshua Halsey.
I was reading something the other day about Wilmington. It said Wilmington was the largest city in the state. At that time, it contained a mostly black population. It was on its way to be Atlanta. Imagine this would have been Atlanta if it hadn't been for November 10th. The wealthiest man in North Carolina lived in Wilmington at that time, and he was black. The closest port to Africa and Europe was Wilmington in the whole United States. And Daniel L. Russell, this article talks about, was a Republican populist governor. Now, he was a Lincoln Republican. Got to say that. He was a Lincoln Republican. And he was elected in 1896. And his opponent, Alfred, I'm telling you who killed Joshua who? His opponent, Alfred Moore Waddell, was an incumbent in the previous cycle, and he refused to accept the election. And if there's anybody out here that's still refusing to accept the election, you can come out here, but you're not participating in the healing because you're keeping the lies going on.
Come on.
He refused to accept the election. Are there any politicians in Wilmington still refusing to accept the election? I know it's none sitting on this stage, I pray. On the day of the elections in 1898, the paramilitary group, it wasn't just a group of violent people, they were paramilitary, known as the Red Shirts. And they didn't march just on November 10, 1898, they marched all the time. Every time there was an election, they were poll watchers. And when you hear people today fighting for more poll watchers and people that can question you at the polls, they're doing the same thing that was done in 1898. 1896, you had cooperation between Republicans and populists, and a lot of people forget it was poor whites and poor black folk that came together in a real way to form the fusion movement. And they had beaten the pro-white Jefferson Davis supremacist Democrats of 1896. And following that, Josephus Daniels used to have a park around here named after him. And he was awarded for the racist use of the News and Observer. He was awarded Secretary of the Navy later in his life. And they came up with a phrase called a cup of joe when you got a cup of coffee. But he used the News and Observer to flame the tensions in North Carolina. Now, most people, white and black, couldn't read, so he used cartoons. And those cartoons would have black politicians depicted as vampires with long nails and teeth. And in their hands, they would be holding a white woman. And with the other hand, they would be pushing back a white man. And the point of those cartoons, those lies, was to suggest that black and white people working together politically was dangerous to America and dangerous to North Carolina. I'm telling you this history because we need to know who killed, say his name,
Joshua Halsey.
And how the killers aren't all dead. They were against Negro domination. They ignored the elections. And they suggested that they had to do this to take America back and make America great again. Oh, go read. See, one of the problems with some of us black folk is you let us in the library, we're going to read. Some of the same language that we hear today is being regurgitated and re-vomited up 123 years ago. There are all kinds of articles written on how the paper was used. But the Bible says when somebody dies, Kojo, violently, and because of injustice, until you hear the cries of their blood and change the systems that caused their death, then you cannot really have healing. So not only must we find the remains from the dead past, we must find and point out the vestiges of systemic racism that are still happening today, that are still going on today. And we must call them out in Joshua's name. You see, if we truly honor Joshua, then we have to be Joshua's today. And we have to call it out when we see it on the city council. We got to call it out when we see it in the county commissioners. We got to call it out when we see it in the state legislature. We've got to call it out when we see it in the Congress. We've got to call it out when we see it in the Senate. We've got to call it out when we see it in the White House. We've got to call it out when we see it in the church. We cannot act as though just coming together out here while all the police are around that everything is fine. Because I'm here to tell you what killed Joshua is still alive today. I almost got the nerve with the cameras here to ask how many people here believe that voter suppression is real. And if you can't raise your hand, then you are part of. How many of y'all, how many folk here believe Trump lost? And if you can't raise your hand, how many folk here believe that resegregation of our public schools is wrong? If you can't raise your hand, how many folk here believe that Fox News tells lies? If you can't raise your hand, how many of you believe that one of the reasons we can't get a Build Back Better plan that would help millions of children and millions of working people is not because there's a deficit? That's a lie. Not because we have a lack of resources, because we spent $21 trillion in militarization of our borders and our communities since 9/11. But we can't get it because senators from the South, the very states that ought to be wanting the things, are so afraid if they do it, it's going to help lift black folk and poor white folk and brown folk and native people. And anybody that's still doing that is operating in the same distortions and lies that created the atmosphere for the killing of, say his name,
Joshua Halsey.
And so as I close, brothers and sisters, we have to do something here more than just stand out here in this rain and hold hands. We got to listen to the blood. And the only way to honor Joshua and all of those who were murdered like him is to understand we don't heal because we have a funeral. We heal when we listen to their voices. We heal when we hear the blood still crying. And Wilmington, the only way to healing, North Carolina, the only way to healing the United States of America, the only way to heal is we have to stand up to the racist and classist politics and lies of our day. That's the only way to honor the life of Joshua yesterday. That's the only way to do it. We have to let the blood and the sound of his blood come into our ears and in our conscience. Because if you listen in the spirit, you hear the blood of Joshua and the blood of those others saying, don't y'all do this again. You better stop listening to this foolishness that's happening today. You better truly come together and stop playing. You better recognize that January 6th was just the beginning. You better understand that there's a political coup d'etat going on in state capitals right now. The folk in Raleigh right now who are writing racist redistricting plans right now are participating in the same spirit that happened in 1896. And we better be able to call it out and cry out and cry out, and we better pick up the truth. And the truth is, we better push further down the road of equal protection under law. We don't need less civil rights, we need more. We don't need less voting rights, we need more. We don't need less living wages, we need more. We don't need less health care, we need more. That's how you honor Joshua. You honor Joshua by finding your own Jericho walls that you need to walk around. And you walk around them till they come tumbling down. You see, God has already honored Joshua. God honored Joshua when he made it. His death didn't determine who he was. Death didn't determine who he was. He was murdered, but he couldn't murder his soul. couldn't murder his spirit. He was made in the image of God. But how we have to honor him now is by hearing the cries of the past and seeing the pain of today. And we can't look for some easy answer. This was a political murder created, Brother County Commissioner, by political systems. And political systems can be as deadly as a bullet. And the only way you can overcome the deadliness of political systems is you must change the political systems. And sometimes you got to be just this raw. When you're sitting on the city council, sitting in the legislature, sitting in the county commissioners, and somebody on that same board starts talking some of this stuff that you know sounds similar to what was happening in 1896, you have to say, wait a minute, are you trying to kill Joshua all over again? Now, they're not going to like it, but that's what you have to say. Because the truth of the matter is, Joshua's blood is crying out. Martin Luther King's blood is crying out. Fannie Lou Hamer's blood is crying out. Still crying. And people in the past, like Joshua, did their part. Fannie Lou did her part. Those 4 students at A&T did their part. Ben Chavis did his part. The Wilmington 10 did their part. Kojo Nantumbo did his part. Mayor Evers did his part. Your fathers and mothers and grandfathers and all, they did their part. The question is, are we going to do our part? And if we do, just maybe, we'll shut it down one more time. And when all is said and done, our living, because that's really what matters. It doesn't matter how you die. The question is, will our living not be in vain? Tell your neighbor, look at him and say, neighbor, I don't want to be a part of killing Joshua all over again. In the complete honor of God and understanding that the ashes go back to the dust, but the spirit that is divine always returns to God. But as we commit these ashes and lay him and so many others' memory to rest, we pray that we will not rest.
I know the blood done signed our name, Joshua.
Again, we appreciate you spending this hour. It is not a one and done. The community would like for you to take this as a first step in learning more about what happened all those years ago. And there are several events over the next several days to do just that. On Tuesday, a screening of The Red Cape at the Cape Fear Museum. That happens in the afternoon from 3:30 until 6 o'clock. And Tuesday evening, a meet and greet with the author of Wilmington's Lie, a journalist who won the Pulitzer Prize for his work in general nonfiction because of this very scenario that you're seeing today. And then on Wednesday at noon to 1, Dr. J. Allen Kirk will be a part of the state marker installation there on 3rd in downtown Wilmington. Again, the state honoring, remembering what happened all those years ago. And also on Wednesday at 6:30 until 8 o'clock, an 1898 commemoration and unity service, bringing us all together in reflection and remembrance of what happened 123 years ago.